Hi, everyone. Today we have a very special panelist with us for an interview on public sociology, the goal towards which we at Doing Sociology are committed to. And we have Michaela Benson with us, who is a professor in public sociology at Lancaster University, a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences, and chief executive of the Sociological Review Foundation. She's a leading social scientist working on migration and citizenship and is particularly known for her research with British citizens living in the European Union. She has published numerous scientific articles and books and has a portfolio that includes freelance writing for the BBC, the Telegraph, and various other publications in the UK, US, and Europe, and the podcast series Who Do We Think We Are and Brexit Brits Abroad. In my opinion, she is a public sociologist to the core, and it is our absolute honor today to have Michaela with us. So, welcome to Doing Sociology, and we look forward to our conversation.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm also a massive fan of Doing Sociology. As I was saying in our pre-chat, I have been following you from day one, and I think what you do is absolutely tremendous. So I'm really delighted to have this opportunity to speak to you today.
Thank you so much. That really means a lot to all of us here. And let me begin by asking you this question about how do you define public sociology today, and particularly in a digital and highly polarized media environment?
I suppose the first thing to say about that is I think it's as vital now as it's ever been. I mean, obviously, I'm coming from a very different part of the world to you, where the conditions for doing this are quite different. But I think it's absolutely vital in this age of kind of misinformation, high volume of information, but also I would say in an age where we know that social science knowledge and understanding around the world is undergoing attack and has been discredited to a large degree. So, finding the spaces for demonstrating why what we do matters for publics broader than our own subject communities is really important. And I know that, this is a kind of a reiteration of a longer standing project of public sociology. There's a long tradition of thinking and talking about this. And obviously, people often go to Michael Borroway's paper from 2004 on that. But you'll know, working from another part of the world, that there's probably a tradition there that's longer standing than that. If we speak to colleagues in South Africa who've been working on the project of what they call critical engagement rather than public sociology, you can see how deeply embedded and deeply political that project of public sociology has been there. In ways that I think often get overlooked in the kind of the Western democracies. And I remember also my colleague Cecilia Menjivar, who's at UCLA, talking about how for her, public coming from Latin America, public sociology is sociology. This is the kind of the commitment that's at the core of that. Let alone mention the kind of the feminist scholars for whom engagement with a whole variety of publics has been central to their methodologies over a very long period of time. So I think we need to kind of honour those traditions, those histories as well, and recognise that public sociology is nothing new and that there's quite a lot that we can learn from past practice that we can bring to bear on the current context. So I think that's, I haven't defined there what public sociology is, and part of that is because I find it really difficult to define. I think for me, it's always been about thinking about which publics would benefit from learning about my research or being part of my research, or particularly the research findings, I would say, and thinking about how best to package those up in order that it can reach those. So I would never limit public sociology, for example, to policy work, which is often the way that it gets limited in the UK. Because I think that actually we should start from the question of who our publics are, rather than define what the outcomes of that might be. So yeah.
Right. That brings us to next question. Then, if you have to sort of, define public sociology, how do you see it as a method, a commitment, or a political stance, or is it something else altogether?
I think this is a really fascinating question, and it really got me thinking. I think from my point of view, it's all of these. I think I've always approached it as something methodological rather than a tool, as might be defined by an understanding of method. Because I think that to really embed this within our practices, we really need to think about how it relates to the research we do, or think about it as part of our research practice. So that's how I've also taught these kinds of engagement and impact work that are part of my own practice. But it can't be dissociated from politics. I think it is a political commitment. It's not just about me going out there and saying, right, I did this amazing piece of research. Look at me, look at what I found. And oh, by the way, it could be useful for these other people. It is something other than that. It is driven by a deep concern that those findings get used for public good. And I say this in inverted commas because that phrase has taken on quite a negative connotation in the UK. So what I mean when I say public good here is for the good of the publics that I'm working with. And I think that that's really probably different to that idea about it. But I think that I see a lot of kind of engagement work going on in UK higher education, where academics are going out and kind of working with local communities. But I think sometimes the academic side of that work gets kind of lost in the push towards what are essentially metrics in the UK, for saying we're doing this kind of civic work. But I think we do have to hold on to the fact that we are academics first and foremost. And when we're doing that public work, we approach it as academics who are trained in scientific method, rigor, all of those kinds of things. Because otherwise, anyone else could be doing what we're doing. So we have to hold on to what it is that we're doing. So for me, it is all of those things. And it's remembering that we're academics, and that, we bring particular skills and knowledge. There are other skills and knowledge that we don't bring to that. But I do also think that this is a collective commitment. And I think this is what's really, really important to me, and certainly has driven the work that I've done at Sociological Review, which is that we need to support one another to do this first and foremost, which is why I think it's really important for us, for those of us who are running these kind of bigger platforms, for promoting public sociology, to kind of come together and to kind of promote one another, support one another, do all of that, but also to develop infrastructures so that people are not acting alone, so that we don't forget prior practice, and that we can develop a kind of a community of practice that can engage in, discussions around, apologies, just a second, this is the doctor. So I think that kind of for me as well, in addition to that list of, is this method, is it politics, is it a commitment? It's also about thinking how we support one another to do this kind of work, how we develop kind of best practice, how we share knowledge with one another, but also how we build an infrastructure that that is outside of our universities, because we know that, universities can be quite prone particularly to kind of political intervention. There can be quite difficult places in which to do work like this. So thinking about infrastructures outside of those institutions that through which we can support that project, a collective project of public sociology, I think that's also really, really important to think about.
Right. You raised an important point about sort of maintaining academic rigor while you're doing public sociology or engaging with the public. So, what are some of the principles which guide your own work while you are trying to, engage publicly while maintaining academic rigor?
Yeah, and I should say, like, this is obviously like an ideal type answer. It's not like I've learned a lot through trial and error, I have to say, over the past decade or so. And I think that it's being comfortable about the fact that you are an academic in that situation, and that the reason that you're being asked to engage in those kinds of projects, or the reasons you might want to do them, are to communicate that the analytical quality of your work. So it is very much based on research and knowledge. And I think that that's always really important because, as I said before, what you wouldn't want is a situation where basically they could substitute anyone in without that academic knowledge and understanding to do that. Now, of course, there's another side of this that I think is really important. We can't, at least in the UK, we can't go into those kinds of projects, those public sociology projects, and expect to communicate in the same way that we would communicate when we write a journal article or write a monograph. Because, of course, what we don't spend that much time doing when we think about writing a journal article or writing a monograph is who our audience is, because we know who the audience is. We know that the audience for those academic writings is likely to be academic. So when it comes to thinking about public sociology projects or public sociology outputs, we need to ask the question of who the publics are and how we can best engage them. And I can guarantee that 9 times out of 10, academic jargon or unprocessed academic thinking is not really the way to do that. So there's a layer of work that goes on to make that kind of research knowledge translatable or accessible to wider audiences. And I don't mean dumbing down when I say that. I think it's about thinking about how we best package up what we have for those audiences. So one of the things that you do really well at doing sociology, and it's, is your ethos, is engaging students, for example. So what do we need to do in order to engage students? And for me, the questions have been, what do I need to do to engage students, as you have done? But also, what do I need to do to communicate to the research publics who've taken part in my research? Or to, for example, I have done work with policymakers and parliamentarians, and each of those different audiences, each of those different publics have very different requirements in terms of how you communicate the academic work. And they have very different assumptions about what academic work is as well. So I think it's kind of that two-way conversation of understanding what you bring, but also thinking about how you package what you have for someone else. And it might be in those circumstances that what you need to do is decenter yourself from this and to recognize that in order to produce some kind of public sociology output, you might need to be working with other experts who have, for example, the skills to produce things in particular ways. And you need to listen to them about how to communicate with those particular publics, while also holding your ground and saying, well, actually, I'm the person who knows this thing about, in my case, very often about migration or citizenship. And I think that can be quite a fine line for some academics to tread. It can be quite uncomfortable, I would say, in the UK case, where academics, particularly in sociology for some reason, can be quite atomized and be quite individualized, and are not necessarily used to that kind of group production approach.
Interesting that you mentioned that. So, what do you see as some of the major ethical challenges of doing public sociology?
I was thinking through this, and I think that, you'll probably be unsurprised about the answers that I come with. I think that if we're thinking about kind of ethics and our relationship to kind of research, the communities we do research with, I think that we can start very much from the point of view of thinking about the extent to which they have been kind of informed about how you're going to use the research, and if you're going to use the research in that way. And our ethical frameworks in the UK have now developed to make very, very clear that if you are going to do that kind of work as part of your research, that the people that you work with know that that's what you're going to do. And I think that this requires thinking very carefully, for example, about how you represent the people that you're working with for those wider publics, which, is something we've been doing for decades and decades and decades anyway. So the politics of representation are really, really vital there. But I do also think that we need to kind of ask questions about who we work with and be very clear about why we're making the choices that we are. And I'm not saying that there are some outlets that we shouldn't work with. People have good justifications for working with a whole range of outputs, depending on what it is they are trying to achieve. So I think it's thinking very clearly about what you're hoping your kind of public engagement will do in terms of knowledge production or in terms of kind of making more accessible the research findings, changing conversations, that kind of things. So learning about the outlets that we're working with, like if you get an approach from, as happens to me quite frequently, from a journalist, asking the question of, well, who is this journalist writing for? What do you think they're likely to do with what I'm about to say? What does that outlook going to prioritize here? How is this going to be used? I think that's really, really important. And thinking about each opportunity, and it's so tempting. I mean, I'm obviously focusing on a very particular kind of approach that you might get to do that public work. It's so tempting to just say yes to everything. But I think, really being clear with yourself about why you're taking up particular opportunities, I think is part of the ethical commitment to the people that you've done research with, if you do that kind of work, as well as kind of to thinking about what that means in terms of who's going to find your outputs, who's going to find out about your research and things like that. I do also think that, as I said before, one of the issues around the kind of the shifting from an agenda which is kind of more research focused and academically research focused towards this more public thing is that we're entering into entire landscapes that we're not familiar with, landscapes and mediascapes. And so thinking about the amount of work that it takes for you to familiarize yourself enough with those to understand how they work, I think is really critical. So recognizing then that actually, if you're going to do this kind of work, it's a time commitment, it's a resource commitment on lots of different levels. And it is necessarily going to take away because let's be honest, there's only so many hours in the day. So it's not something that you could say, okay, right, this journalist called me, it's fine. It'll just be the 3 minutes that they're talking to me while the radio's, while they do the radio show. It's not. That 3 minutes you do half an hour, 45 minutes of preparation for. So you always have to think through that side of things too. And that, of course, comes at the expense of potentially other things that you might be doing. So trying to get a balance, I think, is really important. And I think I've skirted a bit around the kind of the ethical challenges there, but these are kind of some things that I think that people just don't necessarily think through. And recognizing that as soon as your work hits that kind of public level, it's out there for lots of people to see. So thinking, I guess, about our core responsibilities to those that we're doing research with, I think is vital. And you might also ask the question about whether you should be the person voicing those things or whether actually it's more appropriate for someone else. Now, just as a kind of addendum to that, because it's always troubled me, like I do regularly get approached by journalists, but quite often they're approaching me because they want me to introduce them to my research participants. And I have a very standard response, which is I don't do that because that's not my contract with the people that I have done research with. And it is, and I think that has been, I can direct them towards the organizations where I know they will find the people who can do that. But I'm not here in my head as a conduit towards those populations that I've done research with. Now, as I said before, this might be particular to my research, and in other cases, it may be very much more appropriate for an academic to have that kind of practice where they may also be a conduit, but it's never been the case for the research that I have done. So I think that that's quite important to kind of, for me, because of what my research practice is and because of who the communities are I work with, that's not been my agenda.
Very interesting point again. And I think I wanted to ask you about your research and, you have used podcasts, blogs, and public writing. So how does one decide which medium best serves the public role of a sociologist and probably connected to the ethical challenges as well?
Yeah. So, how I came about doing the volume of public work that I do is because of some of the conditions of some funding I received. And I should kind of be clear about that. I worked on a quite high profile project about Brexit and British citizens in the EU. And the condition of the funding was that we were supposed to be feeding into the public and political conversation about Brexit as it unfolded. And I think that I had a pretty good plan about how to do that. My work had kind of covered kind of some of the legal changes that were going on, as well as kind of how those, sorry, as well as how those were experienced by the people that I was working with. And my aim, and I suppose this is kind of what I would say, it's like being very clear about what your aims and objectives are around doing public sociology work, I think really helps to give you a frame to work with. My aims were raising awareness, and they were raising awareness among the community of British people who lived in the EU. That's 1.2 million people who moved from the UK to the EU who are having their rights changed through Brexit, their rights to live and work in the EU, for example, but also to communicate to a set of other publics. So I was very, very clear about who my publics were, and it included politicians and parliamentarians, but also other stakeholders in that. And I think that how I came up with a kind of model for what to do was really to think about who I wanted to communicate with what, I suppose is the way of doing it. And I don't mean what as in terms of medium, but what information did I want to communicate with them. And actually, the podcasting idea was written into the grant right from the start, but it changed. So originally, we were just going to do 6 episodes, which just kind of talked about some of the things that changed. But actually, what happened with it was it became a fortnightly podcast. I think we launched 72 episodes over the period of the project. Um, and it became a way not only of communicating findings from the research, but also of generating some conversations about things that were happening live in the moment. And it was picked up by British citizens who lived across the EU. And it became quite an important resource for them, as well as a kind of an output from the project. Similarly, the blogs, I think, were being used by me as a kind of an entry point into kind of conversations, kind of legal and policy conversations. And so, when something would happen, they were kind of a rapid response that drew from my research to say, well, this thing has happened. So, for example, I'm thinking of one case where there was there was a problem with issuing documentation in one of the member states. This thing has happened. This is what we really need to do in order to address it, because these are the impacts it's having on this group of X number of people. And I think that sometimes served as an initial, very quick response that could then be developed into, evidence for Parliament, or some kind of report, some kind of policy report. So it kind of was a placeholder in some respects, but also a kind of a stepping stone into some of those other conversations that I wanted to be part of. So I think the medium might depend on what you're trying to achieve. So what the route is that you're trying to do. And it might be that it is, as I said, a stepping stone into other kinds of media, into other kinds of issues. Now, for me, one of the things that I've had to be very careful about is the extent to which I produce things myself and distribute them myself, or the extent to which I rely on working with established outlets. And I think that's something to kind of think through very, very carefully, particularly if you're taking your very first steps. I remember the infancy of kind of blogging in sociology in the UK, or writing these kinds of public engagement types of work into your funding proposals. And the bit that was missing was thinking about how things would be distributed and promoted. So how you'd actually get people to pay attention to what you've done, which we really never have to think about, like when it comes to journal articles, because there's a ready-made audience that we assume is there. So along with the medium, it's also thinking about how things travel and making sure that if you're going to invest that time into something, that it is going to travel to where you want it to go. So choosing a medium that's appropriate for the travel that you want to, for the route that you want to take. And if that medium, if you are doing something yourself, really thinking through distribution and promotion. How do you build up an audience of X number of people for a podcast, for example? So I had to do lots of learning around that. But yeah, so it's not just the medium, it's the route and how things travel.
Right. Public sociology often requires emotional labor. And and how do you then sort of manage the affective demands of engaging with diverse and sometimes vulnerable publics?
This is such an important question, Dipali. It is so tricky. And after I think after 2 or 3 years of working on Brexit, I realized I was completely burned out, not only because of the fact that it was a very live topic, but also because I was regularly in communication with people who were directly impacted by an incredibly unsettling change in their lives and were quite desperate for information and knowledge and understanding. I'm not sure that I ever managed it particularly well. I think is the truth. I was clearly doing a lot of emotional labor, and but I suppose that if I kind of think about it a bit more, there are a few things. So I think that this points to the fact that when we're doing this public work, we don't really know what the outcomes will be of that public work. And we have to be honest with the people that we're working with that, what we might be trying to do one thing, but it might not succeed. So particularly when it comes to kind of legal transformations and political issues, we can highlight that we're working towards a particular outcome, but that it's very complicated as to whether that will be achieved. So not over-promising, I suppose, which I suppose is a core component of all we do when we're sociologists in terms of, we can't promise change, but we can say that we're producing the evidence that could potentially lead to change. I think that also it's about thinking about your commitments to the people that you've been working with again, and recognizing that that is going to involve, especially if you're working with, I had some researchers working with me as well, but I was the face of the project. The project was my responsibility. And if people wrote to me, I would write back to them. It wasn't, I wouldn't overlook those people because obviously it's their experiences that are feeding the research. And I think that creating space for that within the project and recognizing that that was part of it was really important. And I think that part of the quite a lot of the outputs from the project really were about the kind of the unsettling and the lack of belonging that people felt, which are, of course, quite effective um, conditions to be working with. And so part of communicating that in a context where people felt they weren't being listened to was really making that visible and really showing that I was hearing them. So I could show them that I was hearing them by writing pieces that highlighted that actually this had been incredibly destabilizing for lots of people, differentially experienced as well, depending on kind of health conditions and how people were positioned within that population. So I think it goes with the territory of doing that public work. If you're doing public work that is based on working with populations who are undergoing quite difficult transformations in their life or who are very vulnerable, or who are disproportionately disadvantaged, all of those kinds of things. So I think the important thing there is to recognize that there is emotional labor at the heart of this, and to build that into your planning and your thinking about things and into your communication with your research communities, but also in terms of how you then communicate their experiences outwardly.
Right. Very often, when one talks about public sociology, there is a tendency to sort of assume that it deals with sort of policy making or, maybe policy change at some level, but that is not necessarily the case. So, how do you see, the limits of public sociology in affecting policy change?
So I think it's really important here to recognise that I'm speaking from the UK and it's quite a particular case, which has its own set of challenges. And I'm sure that there are things that you could tell me about how this works in India or doesn't work. There was a push probably about a push when I started getting research funding in the 2010s. They just introduced this agenda called the Impact Agenda in the UK. And this was very much about getting researchers, for the purposes of public accountability, to focus on how their research would bring about particular types of change. So, how it might transform not just academic knowledge, but how it might bring about some kinds of other changes, particularly, well, I won't say particularly in respect to policy, because I don't actually think that that's what happened. I think what happened was within social science communities, they thought to themselves, well, actually, where could we make a change? Well, we could make a change in respect to public policy. And lots of sociologists got rather fixated and irate about this for a very long period of time. And I think that as that agenda's evolved, it has diversified quite a lot. And I think that's very, very positive, because the routes to make changes in respect to public policy are quite limited. They do exist and it is possible to do. But I think we have to remember that it's only one outcome, one possible outcome of public sociology. And it's very much framed by the conditions within which you're working, by the political conditions. So to give the example again of this research on Brexit, apologies for going on about Britain's withdrawal from the European Union, but one of the issues around the way that the entire Brexit project was framed was that senior politicians were talking about how the public had had enough of experts. So in order to actually communicate with policymakers and parliamentarians, you were encountering this kind of anti-intellectualism at the heart of government, potentially, and you had to find some workarounds. So, some people might have kind of put things to one side. But for me, it meant learning how I might be part of those conversations. It was a very long trajectory to do that. It meant working with policy, with timeframes that I wasn't familiar with. It meant packaging up knowledge in ways that I didn't necessarily have experience of, but which I'm really happy that I know how to do now. So that kind of relationship building is really, really important, working with other timeframes. And I suppose the reason why I highlight that process is because I think that we can very, very quickly decide that doing that kind of policy work isn't for us. And there are a range of reasons why people do that. Some sociologists, as we know, have a deep mistrust of the state and they won't work with the state. And that, I think, is absolutely fine. That's their political commitment. But I also think that if you don't do the groundwork to learn how to make your work travel in a particular way, then actually it's a non-starter. There's you need to think about how you move from one stage to the next. So I don't think it's a question of the limits of public sociology, but it's the limits of our knowledge about how we might do that may lie there. And not everyone wants to do that. And I think that's absolutely fine, because there are so many other spaces in public life where sociology can intervene. But also there is a danger of reducing policy down to government. And of course, there are other ways that you can influence policy. You can influence policy within your institutions, within organizations, within NGOs and charities. But again, it's one dimension, and it's only one of the dimensions that Borowoy highlights in his public sociology piece. So I think we do need to do a lot of work as an international disciplinary community to say, okay, well, yes, you can do policy work if you want to, but public sociology should never be reduced to policy work. We have so many other things that we can bring. So many, some of the projects that I've seen in public sociology about enlivening the sociological imagination, as you do, are, are worth celebrating, perhaps even to a greater degree than what one academic's individual research project might do to support a policy shift. So I think I was going to say it's horses for courses. I think we have to think about what we really want to, where we want to put our energy and make those decisions and stand by them because we cannot do everything. So, yeah.
I think our last question is already answered, but I'm still going to ask it. Where do you see public sociology heading in the next decade or so?
I mean, this is like my wish list, right? So it's like what I would really like to see. I really would like to see us having a better and more connected understanding of the different public sociology projects that are going on. And I mean that at kind of platform level. I'd like to see us working much more together to support one another and to kind of develop those communities of practice around public sociology in ways that are appropriate to the context in which they're being practiced. I'd like to see more knowledge sharing and kind of best practice developing through that. I'd like to see the international sociological community championing for a stronger position for public sociology within the discipline around the world. And I would hope for a space for dialogue and conversation about the scope of this and the conditions under which people are producing public sociology. Because, of course, it's great when we hear about it thriving, but there are also quite significant struggles that people face in getting those projects out into the open. And there are some quite significant risks as well. So if I go back to that quotation, that discussion with Cecilia Menjivar, which was part of the Uncommon Sense podcast at the Sociological Review, we did a bonus episode on public sociology. There were very particular reasons why Latin American scholars would claim that all sociology was public sociology, and it was because they were working under conditions of dictatorship, under political oppression. They were people who were prepared to die for their discipline. So they were prepared to die for the project of sociology. And that's a very different conversation to me trying to get what's happening to British citizens in the EU onto the political agenda in Brexit times in the UK. So I think we do need to be quite carefully attuned to the conditions under which people are able to do this and how those conditions then shape what might be possible in terms of what that public sociology might look like. When it comes to the UK in particular, I would like to see public sociology as a more central facet of research practice. And I think that there's a lot of work to do on training and skills development in that area. And of course, that might be valuable elsewhere too. But I think that the more we can open up the space to have these conversations around a broadly conceived public sociology that doesn't universalize, the better.
Right. Thank you so much. It has been so interesting listening to you, more so because when we started this project of doing sociology, public sociology was sort of at the, core of it. And we've been trying to do our bit, and, listening to you has been, it sort of, re-energizes us and, sort of, would also encourage us to take forward our own project, and for anybody. And I do know a lot of young people, given the context in which they've been trying to do sociology or do academics, are drawn towards public sociology. So this discussion would be very, very insightful to all of them. Thank you so much, Michaela, for talking to us today.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. It's been really lovely to talk to you both.